Ingo Elbe, Postcolonial Theory and Its Consequences. Since the pogrom of October 7th, a wave of hatred against Israel has flooded Western universities. What we are currently seeing is a significant radicalization of left-wing actors, even if the trend of which this is the result itself goes back a long way. What is playing such a significant role in all of this is a type of thinking that has become increasingly popular in many areas of academia, namely postcolonial theory. Is a theory that claims to be able to detect traces of colonialism within forms of knowledge and social structures long after colonial rule itself is formally ended. The motif of, quote, coloniality, end quote, a collective term for the diagnosis of a Western world order that is supposed to have covered the so-called Global South with racist exclusion and genocide for some 500 plus years, is declared to be the main yardstick for historical analysis and social criticism. Adepts of this new grand narrative are convinced that the notion of, quote, coloniality, end quote, they have also hit upon a key for the understanding of Judaism, Zionism, anti-Semitism, and the Shoah, which leads to deep-seated theoretical distortions that are systematic. Anti-Semitism is dissolved conceptually into racism. The Holocaust is relativized as a colonial crime. Israel is demonized, and Islamic and Arab anti-Semitism ignored. The Israeli historian Anita Shapira put it aptly, quote, the Jew as victim becomes an ideal, end quote. The demonization of Israel is a long-standing practice in this movement, and it can take various forms. A direct transference of anti-Semitic motifs onto Israel is common. For example, an icon of the postmodern left, Judith Butler, speaks of Israel, quote, murdering children, end quote. In Butler's accusation that Jews who defend a nation-state are betraying their essence, there is an echo of the legend of the Jew condemned to eternal exile, to a diaspora existence or surrender to the, to the capital O other. In an apt formulation by the Israeli historian Anita Shapira, quote, the Jew as victim becomes an ideal, end quote. This is where the notorious formula, quote, National Socialism equals Israel, end quote, kicks in. Here's the source of the idea of Israel supposedly continuing the process of nationalism, leading to the Holocaust, which is why prominent post-colonials resort to such grotesque analogies. The situation in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank is supposed to remind of Nazi concentration camps or the Warsaw Ghetto. For Ramon Grosfoguel, maybe? Grosfoguel. Quote, Hitlerism as a continuation of colonial racist ideology came back to hunt Palestinians, this time at the hands of European Jews, end quote. Who is Ramon Grosfoguel? Ramon Grosfoguel is a Puerto Rican sociologist who belongs to the modernity/coloniality group Grupo M/C, who is a professor of Chicano/Latino studies in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And in the section on his thought, it says, Ramon Grosfoguel defines his thought as belonging to the decolonial current, surpassing the post-colonial current with which it is considered related. Grosfoguel argues that there is a structural link between modernity and colonialism. He also argues that the effects of European colonialism did not cease with the processes of decolonization and national independence of the 19th and 20th centuries, persisting in culture and ways of thinking, epistemology. It proposes a, quote, decolonial turn, end quote, to carry out epistemological decolonization that corrects the universalist and ahistorical deformations of Eurocentrism and modernity. which it considers in a situation of, quote, terminal crisis, end quote. It puts the accent on the critique of racism and the dividing line that colonial thought makes between the human and the non-human. It defends the idea of intersectionalities of categories such as class and gender, starting from the line of distinction between the human and the non-human that colonial epistemology does. His books include Postcolonial, or at least the ones in English include Colonial Subjects, Puerto Ricans in Global Perspective, Unsettling Postcoloniality, Coloniality, Transmodernity, and Border Thinking. Introduction from University to Pluriversity, a decolonial approach to the present crisis of Western universities, and Decolonizing Postcolonial Studies and Paradigms of Political Economy, Transmodernity, Decolonial Thinking, and Global Coloniality. So that is who Ramon Grosfoguel is. Who's the other person that I meant to look up? Anita Shapira. Anita Shapira is an Israeli historian. She is the founder of the Yitzhak Rabin Center, professor emerita of Jewish history at Tel Aviv University, and former head of the Weizmann Institute for the Study of Zionism at Tel Aviv University. She received the Israel Prize in 2008. Her books include Burl, The Biography of a Socialist Zionist, Burl Katz-Nelson, 1887 to 1944, Land and Power, The Zionist Resort to Force, 1881 to 1948, Essential Papers on Zionism, Zionism and Religion, Israeli Historical Revisionism from Left to Right, Israeli Identity and Transition, Yosef Haim Brenner, a biography, Yigal Alon, Native Son, a biography, Israel, a history, Yosef Haim Brenner, a life, Ben Gurion, father of modern Israel. Anyway, back to the text. So, for Ramon Grosfoguel, quote, Hitlerism as a continuation of colonial racist ideology came back to hunt Palestinians, this time at the hands of European Jews, end quote. In the fight against Israel, quote, the future of humanity is at stake, end quote, no less. According to this redemptive anti-Zionism, quote, the Palestinian victory will take humanity to a higher level of consciousness, end quote. Israel is seen as the incarnation of all Western colonial crimes, quote, eliminating, end quote, the, quote, indigenous people, end quote, in this case, the Palestinians. The U.S. activist Linda Sarsour goes far as to defend the dehumanization of the supposedly white Jewish settlers. For those who don't know who Linda Sarsour is, born 1980, is an American political activist. Linda Sarsour was co-chair of the 2017 Women's March, the 2017 Day Without a Woman, and the 2019 Women's March. Linda Sarsour is also a former executive director of the Arab American Association of New York. She and her Women's March co-chairs were profiled in Times Magazine's 100 Most Influential People in 2017. A Muslim of Palestinian descent, Sarsour first gained attention for protesting police surveillance of American Muslims, later becoming involved in other civil rights issues such as police brutality, feminism, immigration policy, and mass incarceration. Linda Sarsour has also organized Black Lives Matter demonstrations and was the lead plaintiff in a suit challenging the legality of the Trump travel ban. Linda Sarsour's political activism has been praised by some liberals and progressives, while her stance and remarks on the Israel-Palestine conflict have been criticized by some conservatives and Jewish leaders and organizations. Sarsour has advocated for Palestinians in the Israeli-occupied territories and expressed support for the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign against Israel. Sarsour, Bob Bland, and Tamika Mallory stepped down from the Women's March organization in 2019 following a controversy over the organization's handling of accusations of anti-Semitism. Yeah. The U.S. activist Linda Sarsour goes so far as to defend the dehumanization of the supposedly white Jewish settlers. Pointing to the Zionists, Linda Sarsour warns, quote, "If you're on the side of the oppressor, you're defending the oppressor, or you're actually trying to humanize the oppressor, that's a problem," end quote. Linda Sarsour. It's no wonder that London professor Gilbert Achcar, that's how you say his name. Gilbert Achcar is a Lebanese socialist academic and writer. He is a professor of development studies and international relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies of the University of London. Gilbert Achcar's research interests cover the Near East and North Africa, the foreign policy of the United States, globalization, Islam, and Islamic fundamentalism. Gilbert Achcar is a fellow of the International Institute for Research and Education. So what's his bibliography like? Le Nouvelle Guerre Freud, Le Monde après le Kosovo, 1999. English translation included as 2 chapters in Tariq Ali, Masters of the Universe, NATO's Balkan Crusade. Editor of The Legacy of Ernest Mandel, which is like the more conservative end of Trotskyism, pro-Soviet end of Trotskyism. Author, Eastern Cauldron, Islam, Afghanistan, Palestine, Iraq in a Marxist Mirror, 2004. Author, The Clash of Barbarisms, Making of the New World Disorder, published in 2002 and 2006. Editor, The Israeli Dilemma, a debate between 2 left-wing Jews, letters between Marcel Liebman and Ralph Miliband. Author with Michel Warshawski, The 33-Day War, Israel's War on Hezbollah in Lebanon and its Consequences. Author with Noam Chomsky, Perilous Power of the Middle East and U.S. Foreign Policy. Author of Arabs and the Holocaust, 2010. Author, The People Want, A Radical Exploration of the Arab Uprising, 2012. Marxism, Orientalism, Cosmopolitanism, 2013. Morbid Symptoms, Relapse in the Arab Uprising, 2016. There's a critique of Gilbert Achcar's most recent book on the current war between Israel and Hamas on this channel by Barry Finger, who's an editor of the journal, or an editor on the journal New Politics, or newspaper magazine, I guess you call it, I don't know. So back to the text. So it's no wonder that London professor Gilbert Achcar, who as recently as June 2022 was still a guest at the, quote, Hijacking Memory, end quote, conference organized by the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism, ZFA, and the Einstein Forum, celebrates the Hamas massacre of October 7th as a, quote, quasi-desperate act of bravery, end quote. Gilbert Achcar. The more elegant strategy, however, is the humanistically draped demonization of Israel through the derealization of the anti-Semitic brutality itself, as can be found in the popular, quote, contextualizations of the October pogrom. An open letter signed by leading representatives of post-colonial studies such as Dirk Moses and Michael Rothberg, but also by the director of the ZFA, Stephanie Schuler-Springerum, states, quote, 75 years of displacement, 56 years of occupation, and 16 years of the Gaza blockade have generated an ever-deteriorating spiral of violence that can only be arrested by a political solution, end quote. Dirk Moses is one of those like Holocaust relativization people. He just kind of views it as an extension of not fundamentally different than any other type of mass state violence in the past, or something like that. I'm not exactly sure. I'm bastardizing his point, but I know he's something like that. It says Anthony Dirk Moses, born 1967, is an Australian scholar who researches various aspects of genocide. In 2022, Dirk Moses became the Ann and Bernard Spitzer Professor of Political Science at the City College of New York, after having been the Frank Porter Graham Distinguished Professor of Global Human Rights History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dirk Moses is a leading scholar of genocide, especially in colonial contexts, as well as the political development of the concept itself. Dirk Moses is known for coining the term racial century in reference to the period 1850 to 1950. He is co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Genocide Research. His books include The Problems of Genocide, Permanent Security in the Language of Transgression, published in 2021, and German Intellectuals in the Nazi Past, published in 2007. He co-edited or edited the books Decolonization, Self-Determination, and the Rise of Global Human Rights Politics, 2020, The Holocaust in Greece, Postcolonial Conflict and the Question of Genocide, the Nigeria-Biafra War, 1967 to 1970, Colonial Counterinsurgency and Mass Violence, the Dutch Empire in Indonesia, 2014, The Oxford Handbook of Genocide Studies, 2010, Genocide, Critical Concepts and Historical Studies, 2010, The Modernist Imagination, New Essays in Intellectual History and Critical Theory, 2009, Colonialism and Genocide, 2007, Genocide and Settler Society, Frontier Violence and Stolen Indigenous Children in Australian History, 2004-2005, and Empire Colony Genocide, Conquest, Occupation, and Subaltern Resistance in World History, 2009. Michael Rothberg is an American literature and memory studies scholar. He is a professor of English and comparative literature in the 1939 Society Samuel Goetz Chair in Holocaust Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Michael Rothberg was the founding director of the Initiative in Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His selected publications are Traumatic Realism, The Demands of Holocaust Representation, 2000, Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust and the Age of Decolonization, 2009, and The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, 2019. Back to the text. Here, Arab pogroms against the Yishuv in the 1920s and 30s, the Palestinian refusal to accept a Jewish state, the wars of aggression by Arab armies against Israel and its peace offers in 2000 or 2008 are completely ignored. In such Manichaean formulations by leading academics, there's apparently room only for one victim and one perpetrator. At the root of this type of demonization within postcolonial studies, there is, however, a very basic methodological and political deficit. If one takes, as a point of departure, Edward Said's idea of Orientalism, a key example for this way of thinking, then the West invents the image of a degraded Oriental. other in order, invents the image of the degraded Oriental other in order to define itself, to purge its self-image from all that is negative, to create a self-justification for its imperial claim to power. Much of the writing from the post-colonial movement cultivates a double standard. One needs only to take a closer look at the representation of how the, quote, West, end quote, is said to discuss the, quote, global South, end quote. This is always represented as the exercise of illegitimate colonial power, with the substance of such discourse being entirely dismissed. The, quote, global South, end quote, comes to be seen as a victim or as a mute projection surface, and thereby presented as conceptually incapable. The Islamic studies scholar Bernard Lewis has spoken ironically of the, quote, white man's burden of guilt, end quote, a negative superiority mindset that assumes that only white Europeans can be responsible for the world's ills. Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis, who lived from 1916 to 2018, was a British-American historian specializing in Oriental studies. Bernard Lewis was also known as a public intellectual and political commentator. Bernard Lewis was Cleveland E. Dodge Professor Emeritus of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. Bernard Lewis's expertise was in the history of Islam and the interaction between Islam and the West. Bernard Lewis served as a soldier in the British Army and the Royal Armoured Corps and Intelligence Corps during the Second World War before being seconded to the Foreign Office. After the war, Lewis returned to the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London and was appointed to the new chair in Near and Middle Eastern History. In 2007, Lewis called the, quote, West leading interpreter was called, quote, the West leading interpreter of the Middle East, end quote. Others have said Lewis's approach is essentialist and generalizing to the Muslim world, as well as his tendency to restate hypotheses that were challenged by more recent research. On a political level, Lewis's detractors say he revived the image of the cultural inferiority of Islam and emphasizing the dangers of jihad. His advice was frequently sought by neoconservative policymakers, including the Bush administration. His active support of the Iraq War and the neoconservative ideas have since come under scrutiny. Lewis was notable for his public debates with Edward Said, who said Lewis was a Zionist apologist and an Orientalist who, quote, demeaned, end quote, Arabs, representing Islam and promoted Western imperialism, to which Lewis responded by saying Orientalism was a facet of humanism that Said was politicizing the subject. Lewis was also known for denying the Armenian genocide. His argument that there was no evidence of a deliberate genocide carried out against the Armenian people by the Ottoman Empire is rejected by other historians. He said that the mass killings resulted from a mutual struggle between nationalistic movements, a view that has been criticized as, quote, ahistorical. His works include The Assassins, A Radical Sect in Islam, 1967, Race and Color in Islam, 1971, Jews of Islam, 1984, The Political Language of Islam, 1988, Race and Slavery in the Middle East, A Historical Inquiry, 1992, The Middle East, A Brief History of the Last 2,000 Years, 1995, Multiple Identities of the Middle East, The Muslim Discovery of Europe, 2001, What Went Wrong, 2002, From Babel to Dragoman's Interpreting the Middle East, 2004, in 2008 with Buncy Ellis Churchill, Islam, the Religion and the People, Bernard Lewis, also with Buncy Ellis Churchill, Notes on a Century, Reflections of Middle East, a Middle East Historian. Back to the text. The, quote, other, end quote, Islamist regimes and movements such as Iran or Hamas, for instance, seldom feature as protagonists at all. Should their acts of violence and power relations be discussed, they are not taken seriously, anti-Semitic statements are trivialized as the mere rhetoric of desperate victims, and their behavior is interpreted as merely reactive to the actions of the West or those of Israel. At the same time, what are presented as more complex variants of post-colonial thinking suffer from systematic flaws all of their own. Coloniality and liberal democracy are presented as two sides of the same coin, with the result that what is to follow on from, quote, colonial modernity, end quote, remains obscure. A, quote, multipolar world order, end quote, is often praised as an alternative, following a notion of left-wing ethno-pluralism, which lends legitimacy to authoritarian powers such as Russia, Iran, or China. Such, quote, alternative modernities, end quote, are presented under the heading of, quote, hybridity, end quote. Where this leads is that the colonized, whether real or imaginary, are encouraged to engage in a subversive reinterpretation of concepts such as human rights or democracy from within their specific ethno-cultural perspective. Culturally specific human rights or, quote, Islamic democracy, end quote, thus become desirable goals in the struggle against Western hegemony. It is this that leads to ideological alliances between post-colonial leftists and jihadists. So like Judith Butler, Susan Buck-Morss, Walter Mignolo, and Ramon Grosfoguel. Susan Buck-Morss has written other things. Susan Buck-Morss, 1942, is an American philosopher and intellectual. She's currently professor of political science at the CUNY Graduate Center and professor emeritus in the government department at Cornell University, where she taught from 1978 to 2012. Her interdisciplinary work involves, but is not limited to, the fields of art, history, architecture, comparative literature, cultural studies, German studies, history, philosophy, and visual studies. She won a Getty Scholar Grant, a Fulbright Award, and a Guggenheim Fellowship for her work. Awards from the MacArthur Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and Fulbright program funded the research towards her book, Dream World and Catastrophe, The Passing of Mass Utopia in East and West. Her books include The Origin of Negative Dialectics, Theodore W. Adorno, Walter Benjamin, and the Frankfurt Institute, 1977. The Dialectics of Seeing, Walter Benjamin and the Arcades Project, 1989. Dream World and Catastrophe, The Passing of Mass Utopia in East and West, 2002. Thinking Past Terror, Islamism and Critical Theory on the Left, 2003. Hegel, Haiti and Universal History, 2009. Revolution Today, 2019, published with Haymarket Press. Year 1 of Philosophical Recounting, 2021. Seeing, Making Room for Thought, 2023. And Walter Mignolo says Walter Mignolo is an Argentinian semiotician, School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences, and professor at Duke University, who has published extensively on semiotics and literary theory, worked on different aspects of the modern and colonial world, exploring concepts such as decoloniality, global coloniality, the geopolitics of knowledge, transmodernity, border thinking, and pluriversality. Walter Mignolo is one of the founders of the modernity/coloniality critical school of thought. The darker side, his publications include The Darker Side of the Renaissance, Colonization, and the Discontinuity of the Classical Tradition, 1992. Writing Without Words, Alternative Literacies in Mesoamerica and the Andes, 1994. 1994 to 95, The Americas, Loci of Enunciations and Imaginary. The Darker Side of the Renaissance, Literacy, Territoriality, and Colonization, 1995. Local History / Global Designs, Coloniality, Subaltern Knowledge, and Border Thinking, 1999. An article, 2001, Coloniality of Power and Subalternity. Vicissitudes of Theory, contributors Alberto Moreiras, Barbara Herrnstein-Smith, Walter D. Mignolo, Slavoj Žižek, and Ray Chow, Ralph A. Litzinger. The Darker Side of the Renaissance. Okay, that's we've already read that. The Idea of Latin America, Frantz Fanon Prize for Outstanding, or is it these awards now? Are we going into awards? I don't know. 2008, Rereading the Black Legend, The Discourses of Religious and Racial Difference in Renaissance Empires. Dispensable and Bare Lies, Coloniality and the Hidden Political/Economic Agenda of Modernity, in the book Historicizing Anti-Semitism, Proceedings of the International Conference on the Post-September 11th New Ethnic Racial Configurations in Europe and the United States, The Case of Anti-Semitism. The Darker Side of Western Modernity, that's from 2009. The Darker Side of Western Modernity, Global Futures, Decolonial Options, 2011. On Decoloniality, Concept, Analytics, Praxis, 2018. The Politics of Decolonial Investigations, 2021. So that's who Walter Mignolo is. Large swaths of the academic left, back to the text, large swaths of the academic left, however, are engaged in a defense against critique. One labors to block understanding through the simulation of over-complexity. One proclaims that postcolonial theory as a unitary idea does not exist, or one claims that there is an enormous gulf between highly differentiated postcolonial studies and their simplistic reception in activist circles. But for all that, for all the internal differences of postcolonial approaches, the above-mentioned argumentation patterns appear so regularly and so often, especially amongst its high-profile representatives, that it is necessary to speak of a dominant mindset. Finally, these academics themselves often act as activists, presenting themselves as such, manifesting itself not only in the Manichaean and simplistic arguments, sometimes reaching excruciating levels, to be found in the now almost endless number of open letters against Israel. Jews have nothing good to expect from such academic activism in the 21st century. This was first published in the Jüdische Allgemeine. Translation by Frederick van Gelter. Thanks for listening.